The bus rolled through the razor wire gates of Northfield Maximum Security Prison at dawn, carrying 14 men in chains and one man carrying the weight of truth. Judge Marcus Webb sat in the back row, his wrists bound in steel that cut into skin already raw from the county jail transport, and he watched the fortress walls rise around him like the jaws of some ancient beast, closing slowly, deliberately, without mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other inmates whispered prayers or curses or silent resignation, but Webb remained still, his eyes cataloging every detail with the precision of a man building a case brick by brick, guard by guard, violation by violation. Because that was what this was, what he had volunteered for when FBI agent Sarah Okonkwo had sat across from him in his chambers 6 weeks ago and asked if he was willing to become the evidence, to transform himself from judge into witness, to walk willingly into hell so that others might be delivered from it. The intake process stripped him of everything but his purpose. They called his name, Marcus Wells, inmate number 847293, and he stood when ordered, moved when directed, endured hands that searched his body with deliberate roughness that spoke not of security, but of dominance. Officer Derek Garrett stood watching from the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth like a man who had found a new toy and was already imagining how to break it. He was younger than Webb expected, maybe 38, with the kind of compact build that suggested hours in the weight room compensating for insecurities that ran deeper than muscle could reach. And when their eyes met, Webb saw something flicker there. Recognition not of who he was, but of what he represented. Educated, composed, unbroken, everything that men like Garrett spent their lives trying to destroy in others to avoid confronting in themselves. "Got ourselves a quiet one," Garrett said to his partner, Officer Vasquez, who stood beside him with discomfort written across his face like a confession he would never speak aloud. "I like the quiet ones. They always make the best noise when you finally crack 'em open." And the way he said it, with that casual cruelty that had been refined through years of unchecked power, told Webb everything he needed to know about what the coming days would hold. This was not a man who inflicted pain because policy demanded it or circumstances required it. This was a man who had found purpose in cruelty, identity in domination, and the prison system had given him the keys to the kingdom. They led Webb through corridors that echoed with distant screaming and closer laughter, past cells where eyes tracked his movement with the predatory calculation of men who had learned that survival meant knowing who was weak and who was dangerous and where Webb might fall on that spectrum. An inmate passed close, shoulder brushing his, and Webb felt the weight of assessment in that brief contact. Raymond Foster, he would learn later, 41 years old, 15 years into a sentence that had already stolen his youth, but had not quite managed to kill his instinct for reading people. And Foster's eyes lingered just a moment too long, curiosity sparking behind the practiced indifference, as though something about this new arrival did not fit the pattern of broken men and hardened criminals that populated these walls. D-block solitary confinement smelled of bleach and despair and something older, something that had soaked into the concrete over decades of men locked away from light and hope and the basic dignity of human contact. Webb's cell was 6 feet by 8 feet, a concrete box with a steel toilet, a thin mattress on a metal frame, and a single barred window too high and too narrow to offer anything but a reminder of the sky he could no longer reach. Garrett personally escorted him inside, making a show of inspecting the space as though concerned for his comfort, and then, with deliberate casualness, he leaned close enough that Webb could smell the coffee on his breath and the malice in his words. "You got that educated look about you, Wells, that quiet dignity, like you think you're better than this place, better than us." Garrett's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I've broken men twice your size and half your age. The ones with dignity fall the hardest, because they got the furthest to drop. You're going to learn real quick that everything you thought you were means nothing in here. You're just meat now, my meat, and I decide how tender or how tough your life gets." He let that hang in the air like smoke before stepping back, his boots echoing on concrete as he walked away, locking the cell door with the finality of a coffin closing. Webb sat on the thin mattress and let the silence settle around him like water filling a drowning man's lungs. His mind drifted to Diana, his wife of 26 years, who believed he was on a classified judicial sabbatical, reviewing federal sentencing guidelines in Washington. He thought of his father, dead now 15 years, who had spent 3 years in a place like this for a crime he did not commit, who had emerged broken in ways that no apology or compensation could repair. And he thought of Agent Okonkwo's words in their final briefing. "You'll document everything, Your Honor. Every violation, every perpetrator, every witness. But the hardest part won't be enduring the abuse, it will be choosing not to end it when you have the power to do so with a single word." Night fell through the high window, moonlight cutting across the floor in a thin shaft that reminded Webb of surgical precision, of how justice, when properly applied, could cut through corruption with the same clean certainty. He discovered a loose tile near the toilet, the kind of small blessing that felt deliberate in a place where nothing was accidental. Beneath it, a space just large enough for the small notepad and pencil stub he had smuggled in, sewn into the lining of his underwear during the chaos of intake. He wrote in the darkness, his handwriting cramped but precise, documenting names and times, and the pattern of abuse he could already see forming like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Derek Garrett, intake supervisor, unnecessary force during processing, racial slurs disguised as humor. Officer Luis Vasquez, passive witness, complicit through silence. Cell 147, D-block, solitary confinement, no working light, mattress stained with substances he preferred not to identify. And then he coded it, the system he and Okonkwo had developed, turning his observations into what would appear to be nothing more than the confused scribblings of a man struggling with
confinement, but which would translate in her hands into admissible evidence of systematic human rights violations. The intercom crackled to life near midnight, Garrett's voice cutting through the darkness like a blade testing flesh. "Sleep tight, Wells. Tomorrow we start breaking you in proper. I got a feeling about you, a feeling that you're going to need special attention. The quiet ones always do. They think silence is strength, but I know better. Silence is just fear that hasn't found its voice yet. And I'm real good at helping men find their voices, real good at making them scream." Webb lay back on the mattress, his jaw set like stone, his eyes fixed on that shaft of moonlight that refused to be extinguished no matter how dark the cell became. And in that moment, lying in a place where dignity went to die and hope was rationed like water in a desert, he made the same promise he had carried through every difficult decision of his judicial career. Patience until the strike. Documentation until the case is airtight. Justice delayed is justice refined. And when the moment comes, when the evidence is gathered and the truth can no longer be denied, the weight of the law will fall with the force of righteous thunder on every man who thought power meant permission to inflict suffering without consequence. Days in solitary confinement bled together like wounds that refused to heal, each one indistinguishable from the last except in the creative variations of cruelty that Officer Garrett employed with the dedication of an artist perfecting his craft. Webb learned the rhythm of it, the way abuse followed patterns when inflicted by men who had grown comfortable in their tyranny. Morning wellness checks at 4 a.m., flashlights blazing through the cell door slot directly into his face, sleep interrupted with the precision of enhanced interrogation techniques that Webb recognized from his years reviewing terrorism cases. Meals delivered cold, when they came at all, the food often contaminated with substances Webb preferred not to identify but documented nonetheless in his hidden notes. Spit, possibly urine, the guards laughing as they watched him decide whether starvation or humiliation would be his choice for the day. The cell searches came randomly, or so they were meant to appear, but Webb saw the pattern in the randomness. Every third day, usually during the small window when he might have achieved genuine rest, Garrett and two other guards would storm in with the pretense of security concerns and the reality of destruction. They tore through his few possessions, the replacement notepad given to him by a sympathetic intake administrator, the legal thriller he had been allowed from the prison library, the extra blanket that Officer Thornton had quietly left outside his cell after a particularly cold night. They destroyed everything systematically. Pages torn from books, mattress flipped and examined with exaggerated thoroughness, his legal pad confiscated under the excuse that inmates don't need to be writing novels about conditions. And Webb endured it with that same unsettling calm that seemed to infuriate Garrett more than any resistance could have, his eyes tracking every violation, his mind filing away evidence like a court clerk recording testimony. Officer Maya Thornton watched from the corridor during the third search, her presence mandated by policy that required female officers to witness certain inmate interactions for liability purposes. Webb caught her eye once, just for a moment, and saw something there that did not belong in a place like this. Conscience struggling against cowardice, moral awareness fighting the pragmatic terror of being a single mother who could not afford to lose a job that barely paid enough to cover childcare and rent. She looked away first, shame coloring her face, but not before Webb understood that here was an ally if he can only find the way to reach her without compromising his cover or endangering her fragile stability. In the general population, invisible to Webb, but working on his behalf without knowing why, Raymond Foster had begun asking questions. The prison grapevine carried information faster than official channels, and word had spread about the quiet man in solitary who took abuse like other men breathed, who never complained or retaliated or showed the slightest crack in his composure. Foster traded commissary items for information, cigarettes for gossip, small favors for the stories guards told in the break room where inmates working cleaning detailed overheard everything. The quiet one in 147, they called him. The educated one that Garrett's got a hard-on for breaking. And Foster, who had spent enough time in prison to develop instincts sharper than most people's conscious reasoning, felt something wrong about the whole situation, something that did not fit the pattern of men destroyed by solitary or hardened by violence. The day Garrett withheld Webb's meal entirely, keeping him without food for 24 hours under the pretense of disciplinary restriction for an infraction that existed only in Garrett's imagination, marked a turning point in the systematic torture. Webb felt his body weakening, the combination of sleep deprivation and malnutrition beginning to affect his concentration, his ability to maintain the mental discipline that kept him functional. His hands shook slightly as he tried to write that night, his coded message to Okonkwo less precise than usual. And for the first time since entering Northfield, he felt the whisper of doubt asking whether any investigation was worth this price, whether evidence gathered at the cost of his health and sanity could ever be justified. But then Garrett delivered the meal personally the following evening, entering the cell with that same predatory smile, setting the tray down with exaggerated care. "See, Wells, I'm not cruel. I'm just teaching you the way things work in here. You behave, you eat. You disrespect me with that silent judgment you got going, you go hungry. Simple economics." He leaned against the cell wall, arms crossed, watching Webb with the intensity of a scientist observing a lab rat's response to stimulus. "What I can't figure is why you won't break. Every man breaks eventually. It's just a question of finding the right pressure point. Some men it's pain. Some men it's fear. Some men it's taking away their dignity piece by piece until there's nothing left but animal survival." He dropped his voice lower, intimate in his cruelty. "I got time, Wells, all the time in the world, and you're not going anywhere. So eventually I'm going to find what breaks you, and when I do, when you finally crack open and show me that weakness you're hiding, that's going to be the best day of my career." Webb ate the meal in silence, never taking his eyes off Garrett, and in that exchange something shifted. The guard expected fear or anger or pleading, any response that would validate his power and confirm his narrative of dominance. But Webb gave him nothing except that steady gaze, the look of a man who had seen worse and survived worse and knew things about power that Garrett could not begin to comprehend. And for just a moment, uncertainty flickered across the guard's face, the first hairline crack in his armor of confidence. When Garrett left, slamming the cell door with unnecessary force, Webb allowed himself the luxury of a flashback, his mind drifting to his father's kitchen table on a Sunday morning 20 years dead, the old man's hands shaking slightly from the nerve damage prison had inflicted, his eyes distant as he told his son about the guards who had used their authority like weapons and the system that had protected them until evidence finally forced accountability. "You want to change things?" his father had said. "You gotta be willing to endure what others won't. You gotta document what others can't. And you gotta believe that justice, when it finally comes, hits hard enough to make all the suffering mean something." Webb ate every bite of that contaminated meal, documenting its contents, noting the time and Garrett's exact words, building his case entry by entry, violation by violation. Outside his cell, Officer Thornton lingered in the corridor longer than protocol required, her presence a silent acknowledgement that she had witnessed the withholding of food and understood its implications. And in the general population, Foster made a decision based on instinct rather than evidence, spreading the word through channels Webb would never know existed. The quiet man in 147 was protected now, under Foster's informal shield, and anyone who understood prison politics would respect that boundary. Warden James Cartwright conducted his weekly walkthrough of D Block on the 5th day, his polished shoes clicking on concrete with the rhythm of authority that had never been challenged. He paused outside Webb's cell for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to glance inside and catalog the inmate's condition, not long enough to suggest concern or care. Webb watched him through the bars, memorizing the face, the expensive watch, the casual indifference that marked men who had insulated themselves from the consequences of their choices. And Cartwright, feeling those eyes on him, felt something he had not experienced in years, the uncomfortable sensation of being seen not as warden, but as enabler, as the architect of a system that required men like Garrett to function and men like Wells to be broken for it to maintain its equilibrium. That night, Webb managed to pass a coded message during the brief medical check that policy mandated for solitary inmates, a 30-second interaction with a nurse who barely looked at him while checking blood pressure and pulse. The message was hidden in his response to routine questions, his words carefully chosen to convey information that Okonkwo would recognize and Garrett would dismiss as confused rambling. "Sleep has been difficult since the Tuesday transfer." Tuesday transfer meant Garrett. "The food here disagrees with my stomach on the 5th day of every week." 5th day meant systematic pattern. "My father always told me patience was the longest road but the surest destination." Patience meant maintain cover, evidence building, stay the course. As moonlight cut across his cell floor that night, Webb whispered the oath that had sustained him through 20 years on the bench and would carry him through however many more days remain before justice could be served. Not blind revenge, but calculated reckoning. Not rage, but documented truth. And when the moment came, when Agent Okonkwo walked through these doors with federal warrants and the full weight of the Department of Justice behind her, every man who had mistaken power for permission would learn that the law, when wielded by those who believe in it, could strike with the force of righteous thunder. The prison grapevine hummed with speculation about the quiet man in cell 147, stories spreading through C Block and D Block and the general population like wildfire jumping fire breaks, each telling embellished slightly, but all agreeing on the essential mystery. Marcus Wells took abuse that should have broken him, endured cruelty that had destroyed harder men, and never once showed the expected response of either collapse or retaliation. Some inmates interpreted his silence as weakness, the kind that would eventually explode into violence that the guards would use to justify extended solitary or transfer to supermax facilities where men disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Others saw calculation, the patience of someone playing a longer game than the guards understood. And a few, Raymond Foster among them, sensed something deeper, something that did not fit the typical pattern of prison survival. Foster engineered the meeting during the court-mandated recreation period for solitary inmates, a concession to legal requirements that gave D-block prisoners 2 hours per week and a concrete yard barely larger than their cells, but open to the sky. The supervision was heavy, guards stationed at every corner, but Foster had learned over 15 years that even in the most controlled environments, gaps existed for those who knew how to find them. He approached Webb during the 15-minute window when guards rotated positions, his movements casual but purposeful, and sat on the bench where Webb stood staring at clouds that reminded him of Diana's painting in their bedroom, the landscape she had started before his sabbatical and would finish when he returned, if he returned. "You don't move like an inmate," Foster said without preamble, his voice low enough that the nearest guard would not register the conversation as worth investigating. Webb turned slowly, meeting Foster's eyes with that same unsettling calm that had become his signature. "I move like a man trying to survive." "No." Foster shook his head slightly, certainty in his tone. "Survivors flinch. Survivors show the strain. You're doing something different. You're enduring with purpose, like the abuse itself is part of a plan. And that makes me curious, Wells, because I've seen a lot of men in here, and you don't fit any category I recognize." For a long moment, Webb said nothing, weighing the risk of engagement against the value of having an ally within the prison population who could observe what he could not see from solitary. Finally, he spoke, his words carefully chosen to reveal nothing while acknowledging everything. "Some men survive by fighting, some by submitting. I survive by remembering that nothing lasts forever, not even this."
Foster studied him, the intelligence in his eyes sharpened by years of reading men's intentions in environments where misreading could mean death. "You're educated, probably college, maybe more. You speak like someone who's comfortable with authority, not afraid of it. And you take Garrett's abuse like it's temporary, like you know something he doesn't about how this story ends." He leaned back, casual posture masking intense focus. "I don't know what your game is, Wells, but I respect it. And I'm putting word out that you're protected. Not because I know your secret, but because men like you are rare in here, and men like you are worth protecting until we figure out who you really are." The conversation ended as guards closed the gap, but the alliance had been forged, invisible but real. Foster's network now working on Webb's behalf without understanding why or how it would matter. And as Webb returned to his cell, he carried with him the knowledge that even in the most controlled environment, human instinct toward justice could create unexpected allies. That afternoon, during a routine transport from his cell to the infirmary for the mandated weekly medical check, Garrett escalated from psychological warfare to physical violence. The corridor was empty except for Garrett and Vasquez, the cameras positioned at angles that Garrett knew intimately from 12 years of learning how to abuse inmates without leaving prosecutable evidence. He stopped the transport abruptly, claiming Webb had stumbled, and shoved him hard against the concrete wall, the impact driving the air from Webb's lungs and sending pain radiating through his ribcage. Garrett's forearm pressed against Webb's throat, not quite choking, but close enough to send the message clearly. "You think you're tough, Wells? You think silence makes you strong?" Garrett's face was inches from Webb's, his breath hot with coffee and rage. "I've broken tougher men than you. I've made soldiers cry. I made gang leaders beg. And I'm going to break you too, because that's what I do. That's what I'm good at. And the longer you resist, the sweeter it's going to be when you finally crack."
Webb met his eyes, saying nothing, his silence more threatening than any verbal response because it denied Garrett the satisfaction of either fear or defiance. And in that moment, something snapped in the guard's carefully maintained control, his baton swinging with the kind of practiced precision that spoke of frequent use, catching Webb in the ribs with force calculated to crack but not to shatter, to hurt but not to leave marks visible through clothing. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, white-hot agony that Webb absorbed with only the slightest intake of breath, his face remaining impassive even as his mind categorized the injury, documented the violation, added another charge to the growing list that would eventually bury Garrett and everyone who enabled him. Officer Vasquez watched from 3 feet away, shame written across his face like a confession he lacked the courage to speak, his hand hovering near his radio but never quite reaching it, never quite making the call that policy required and conscience demanded. And in that hesitation, in that failure to act, Vasquez became not just a witness but a participant, his complicity through silence as damaging as Garrett's active cruelty. Dr. Patricia Moreno conducted Webb's psychological evaluation that evening, her office a small space carved from what had once been the storage room, furnished with the bare minimum required by state regulations and her own professional ethics. She was 50 years old, 23 years into a career that had started with idealism and had gradually been eroded by the reality of a system that valued order over rehabilitation, punishment over healing. She had seen the reports on Wells, the pattern of isolation, and the guard's comments about his unusual composure, and she approached the evaluation with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned not to care too much because caring in a place like this was a luxury that led to burnout or termination. But when Webb entered her office, moving carefully because of the ribs Garrett had cracked, she saw something that triggered her professional instincts. He sat without being told, his posture straight despite obvious pain, his eyes meeting hers with a directness that inmates typically avoided because prison taught men to hide from scrutiny rather than invite it. She went through the standard questions, the assessment tools designed to identify mental health deterioration, suicide risk, and adjustment disorder. And his responses were textbook appropriate, showing resilience beyond what the circumstances should allow, demonstrating coping mechanisms that suggested either extraordinary mental discipline or previous experience with high-stress environments that had nothing to do with incarceration. "You show signs of PTSD, Mr. Wells," she said carefully, watching his reaction, "but not the kind I typically see in inmates. Your symptoms suggest exposure to systematic trauma that predates your arrival here. That's unusual." Webb held her gaze, weighing how much truth he could afford to reveal, deciding on misdirection rather than lies. "I served. Overseas. The kind of places that stay with you long after you leave them." It was technically true. He had served on the federal bench hearing cases involving veterans, war crimes, the human cost of military action, and it was effectively false, giving her an explanation that would satisfy her professional curiosity without exposing his actual identity. But something in Moreno's eyes suggested she heard the deception beneath the truth, that her years of evaluating men who lied for survival had taught her to recognize when a story fit too perfectly to be entirely honest. She documented her concerns in the evaluation report, couching them in clinical language that would appear routine to anyone not reading carefully, but which she hoped might trigger review by someone higher in the administrative chain who still possessed conscience. Subject demonstrates unusual psychological resilience. Recommend continued monitoring. Concerns regarding adequacy of current placement and supervision. That night, after the evaluation, after Moreno's carefully worded report had been filed and ignored by a system that did not want to know what it already suspected, Garrett entered Webb's cell alone, the cameras in D block mysteriously malfunctioning in a pattern that had become routine whenever guards needed privacy for activities they preferred not to document.
He brought no weapon beyond his fists and his authority, both of which he had learned were sufficient to break men who had no recourse, no protection, no hope of justice beyond the mercy he chose to grant or withhold.
The beating was methodical, professional in its brutality, targeting areas that would not show through clothing and would heal without permanent visible damage. Garrett had learned his craft through repetition, knew exactly how hard to hit to cause maximum pain without crossing the line into injury that would require hospital transfer and external documentation. He narrated as he worked, his voice conversational, explaining to Webb how power really functioned in places like this, how the law meant nothing behind these walls, how authority belonged to whoever was willing to use it without hesitation or mercy. Webb endured it as he had endured everything else, his mind separating from his body through techniques he had developed not through military service, but through years of listening to testimony about torture, about systematic abuse, about the human capacity to survive what should destroy us. He documented it internally even as it happened, memorizing Garrett's exact words, the pattern of strikes, the way the guard's breathing accelerated with each blow as though the violence itself provided some perverse satisfaction that transcended professional sadism and approached genuine pathology. When Garrett finally left, when the cell door locked and the cameras mysteriously restored function, Webb lay on the thin mattress and thought about his father, about the stories the old man had told of similar nights in similar cells with similar guards who believed their power was absolute and their actions beyond consequence. And he whispered the same promise his father had made him swear on his law school graduation day. When you have power, use it to protect those who don't. When you don't have power, survive long enough to reclaim it, and never, ever forget what it felt like to be powerless, because that memory will make you a better judge than any law school could teach you to be. The moonlight cut across the concrete floor, thin and precise as justice should be. And Webb added another entry to his hidden documentation, his handwriting cramped but steady, despite the pain that radiated through his torso with every breath. Officer Derek Garrett, assault with intent, D-Block cell 147, cameras disabled during attack, pattern of systematic abuse confirmed beyond reasonable doubt, evidence building, case strengthening, justice delayed but not denied. And when Agent Okonkwo finally walked through these gates with federal warrants and the full authority of the law behind her, every man who thought power meant immunity would learn that patience and documentation were weapons sharper than any baton, more powerful than any badge. Webb's story spread through Northfield like electricity through water, invisible but undeniable, touching every cell and every corridor until even men who had never seen him knew his name and wondered at his nature. The whispers painted him in colors that ranged from weakness to calculation to something approaching mythological, and inmates who had spent years developing survival instincts could not agree on which interpretation fit the facts. Some said he was broken, that his silence was the quiet of a man already dead inside, just waiting for his body to catch up. Others recognized something more dangerous, the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and they gave him space the way animals give space to creatures they cannot quite classify as prey or threat. Terrence T-Bone Williams heard the stories through his network, the invisible web of influence he had spent 17 years building in a system that ran on two economies, the official one of guards and rules, and the shadow one of respect and favors and carefully negotiated power. T-Bone was 45 years old, serving life for a murder he had committed at 28 in a moment of rage that had cost him everything and given him a strange kind of freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. He ran the commissary trades, the protection rackets, the information flow that kept general population stable enough that guards could pretend they were in control. And when multiple sources told him about the quiet man in D-Block who took abuse that should have broken him, T-Bone made a decision based on instinct rather than evidence. He sent word through Raymond Foster, the message traveling through channels that guards could not track and administrators did not know existed. Protection was offered, the kind that meant other inmates would not test Webb and guards would think twice before casual cruelty if they knew the prison's power structure had taken interest. But Webb declined through Foster, his refusal polite but absolute, and that refusal told T-Bone more than acceptance would have. Men who declined protection were either fools or they were playing a game that transcended prison politics, and Webb did not move like a fool. Officer Maya Thornton made her first real choice on a Tuesday morning when she found antibiotics in the supply closet that should have been logged but had been overlooked in the chaos of a medical shipment. She thought about the infection she had seen developing in Webb's split lip, the wound Garrett had reopened 3 times through casual backhand strikes that left no lasting evidence but prevented healing. She thought about her son, 4 years old, asking why Mommy seemed sad all the time, and she made a calculation that had been building for weeks. The antibiotics appeared outside Webb's cell during a shift change, placed where he would find them but where cameras would not clearly record who had left them. It was a small rebellion, meaningless in the scope of institutional corruption, but it was hers, and it marked the moment when her conscience became louder than her fear. The prison-wide shakedown came without warning on a Thursday, guards flooding through every block with the kind of aggressive energy that spoke of orders from above and quotas to meet. They tore through cells methodically, destroying property under the excuse of security, and when they reached D Block, Garrett personally supervised Webb's cell search with the enthusiasm of a man who had been planning this moment for weeks. He found the contraband exactly where he had planted 2 hours ago, during a shift when Vasquez had been conveniently assigned elsewhere. A small bag of pills that could have been anything, which Garrett's report would identify as controlled substances, and a sharpened piece of metal that resembled a weapon if you ignored the fact that it still had price tags from the commissary attached.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The disciplinary hearing took place in Warden Cartwright's office, a wood-paneled room that spoke of authority and permanence and the kind of institutional power that operated beyond the reach of individual accountability. Cartwright sat behind his desk, Garrett stood by the door, and Webb sat in the chair reserved for inmates, his hands cuffed despite the hearing being officially informal. The warden reviewed the evidence with theatrical thoroughness, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had conducted this performance hundreds of times and knew exactly how it would end. Mr. Wells, these are serious violations. Possession of contraband, possession of a weapon, both of which carry mandatory extensions of solitary confinement and potential criminal charges. Cartwright leaned back, his expensive chair creaking with the sound of comfort that contrasted sharply with the metal seat Webb occupied. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Webb met his eyes with that same unsettling calm that had become his signature, and when he spoke, his voice carried the precision of someone who had spent 20 years asking questions from a bench rather than answering them from a defendant's chair. I would note for the record that the contraband was discovered in a location I could not have accessed without tools I do not possess, that the alleged weapon still bears commissary identification, suggesting it was never processed for individual sale, and that the timing of this discovery, immediately following my medical complaints about Officer Garrett's conduct, suggests coordination rather than coincidence. The silence that followed was profound. Cartwright's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty or might have been recognition that the man sitting across from him spoke with an authority that did not match his inmate status. Garrett shifted his weight, tension visible in the way his hand moved toward his baton before stopping, as though his body recognized a threat his conscious mind had not yet identified. Your observations are noted and disregarded, Cartwright said finally, his voice now harder, the veneer of judicial fairness cracking to reveal the pragmatic cruelty beneath. 90 days extension of solitary confinement, effective immediately. And Mr. Wells, I would suggest you adjust your attitude. Inmates who make accusations against staff tend to find their time here considerably more difficult. Foster watched from the corridor as they led Webb back to D Block, and he saw something in the guards' faces that confirmed what he had suspected. This was not random punishment, but calculated suppression. And the question that burned in his mind was what could a man have done or seen or known to warrant this level of institutional attention? He spread the word through his network that night, not the official story of contraband, but the truth of a frame-up, and inmates who understood prison politics nodded with the grim recognition that when the system moved this aggressively against one man, it meant that man represented a threat worth eliminating. Agent Sarah Okonkwo received Webb's coded message 36 hours after the hearing.
delivered through channels that involved 3 intermediaries and encryption that would have impressed cybersecurity professionals. The message was brief but clear. Frame-up confirmed. Conspiracy between Garrett and Cartwright documented. Timeline accelerating. Request authorization to move to final phase. She sat in her field office in Chicago, reading the decoded text 3 times, and made the decision that she had known was coming since the operation began. She called her supervisor, requested emergency authorization, and began coordinating with federal prosecutors to build the case that would bring the full weight of the Department of Justice down on Northfield Maximum Security Prison. Webb spent that night in his cell thinking about the way Cartwright's face had changed when he spoke, the momentary uncertainty that suggested the warden had seen something in Webb's bearing or language that did not fit the profile of a convicted criminal. It was a risk, that moment of revealing more education than his cover story should allow, but it was a calculated risk, because every interaction now was building toward the revelation that would turn victim into judge and transform documentation into prosecution. He wrote in the darkness, his notes more detailed than ever, and he thought about Diana at home, believing he was reviewing sentencing guidelines in Washington, and he promised himself that when this was over, when justice had been served and the evidence had been heard, he would tell her everything, and they would decide together whether the cost had been worth the truth. The 90 days extension transformed Garrett's abuse from systematic cruelty into methodical torture, the kind that left no permanent physical evidence but destroyed men from the inside out through the accumulated weight of suffering without hope of end. Webb endured sleep deprivation that pushed him to the edge of hallucination, the lights in his cell never dimming and the intercom crackling into life at random intervals with sounds designed to prevent rest. Screaming, laughter, Garrett's voice reading from disciplinary manuals with the monotone of psychological warfare. The temperature fluctuated from freezing cold that left Webb shivering on his thin mattress to oppressive heat that made breathing feel like drowning. The climate control weaponized through the same deliberate malice that characterized every aspect of his confinement. Food became another battlefield, meals arriving sporadically and often deliberately contaminated, and Webb learned to calculate which hunger was worse, the physical emptiness or the psychological cost of consuming food that had been defiled by men who enjoyed watching him make that choice. His weight dropped, his body consuming itself for energy, and the mirror in his cell showed a face he barely recognized, gaunt and hollow-eyed, though his mind remained sharp through sheer discipline and the knowledge that every day of suffering was another day of documentation, another violation that would appear in the federal indictment that was building like a storm beyond these walls.
Dr. Patricia Morena requested emergency psychological evaluation after reviewing intake medical reports that showed Webb's deteriorating condition, her clinical concern overriding the unwritten rule that staff did not question decisions made by Warden Cartwright. Her request was denied through official channels, but she began documenting irregularities independently, building a file that violated prison policy but honored her professional ethics. Notes the detailed patterns of abuse and institutional failure to intervene despite clear evidence of harm. Officer Thornton found herself outside Webb's cell more frequently than her duties required, drawn by guilt and a growing conviction that silence was not neutrality, but complicity. She took photographs through the cell door slot when shift changes created brief windows of privacy, digital images that captured the visible effects of systematic torture, the weight loss, the exhaustion, the injuries that appeared and disappeared without medical documentation, and she contemplated the choice that was no longer theoretical but immediate: remain silent and employed, or speak truth and face consequences that would extend beyond her job to her custody arrangement, her son's stability, everything she had built on the foundation of a paycheck from an institution that demanded moral compromise as the price of survival. The false message came on a Wednesday morning, delivered by Garrett with the casual cruelty of a man who had perfected psychological warfare through repetition. "Got a call from your wife's lawyer, Wells. Divorce papers. Guess you got tired of waiting for a man who's never coming home." He slid a photocopied document through the cell door slot, official looking enough to seem legitimate, though Webb recognized immediately it was fabricated from the formatting errors and legal language that no actual attorney would use. But knowing it was false did not eliminate its impact, because exhaustion and isolation had eroded the mental defenses that protected against manipulation, and for a moment Webb felt the weight of despair pressing down with the force of all the accumulated suffering, questioning whether any mission was worth this cost, whether justice delayed had become justice impossible. He thought about Diana, about their last conversation before the operation began, her eyes full of fear masked as support, and he whispered her name in the darkness like a prayer or promise that he would survive this, that he would return to her, that the man who walked out of Northfield would still recognize himself in the mirror even if the face had changed. Raymond Foster organized the silent protest without announcement or coordination, simply refusing his breakfast tray when it arrived, and other inmates in D Block followed his example through the prison telepathy that communicated resistance faster than any verbal planning could have. The guards did not understand the cause, only that suddenly 24 men were refusing food in solidarity with something or someone, and the disruption created ripples that extended beyond the immediate inconvenience to suggest that control was not as absolute as administrators believed. Agent Okonkwo faced pressure from DOJ leadership to extract Webb before the operation resulted in permanent harm or death. Bureaucrats who understood liability better than they understood justice, arguing that the evidence gathered was sufficient and the risk had become unjustifiable. She defended the operation with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had personally recruited Webb, who had promised him backup and support, who would not abandon him now when he was closest to documenting the full scope of corruption. But she also prepared extraction protocols, coordinated with tactical teams, and made the unilateral decision that if Webb's next coded message suggested imminent danger to life, she would authorize intervention, regardless of official authorization or the impact on the broader investigation. The beating came on a Friday night, when Garrett arrived at Webb's cell drunk on power and possibly alcohol, his movements less controlled than usual, his words slurred with the kind of rage that had been building for weeks as Webb's continued existence became a personal affront to everything Garrett believed about power and dominance and the natural order of men who give pain and men who receive it. He entered the cell alone, the cameras once again mysteriously offline, and he beat Webb with his fists and baton and the accumulated fury of someone whose identity had been built on breaking others and who could not comprehend why this one man would not break. Officer Maya Thornton witnessed it through the crack in the corridor door, where she had positioned herself deliberately, her phone recording video through a gap she had measured and planned for, her hands shaking but steady enough to capture evidence that would be inadmissible in any court, but which would provide proof to federal investigators that the documentation Webb had been gathering was not exaggerated, but if anything understated the reality of systematic torture disguised as correctional supervision. Webb lost consciousness before the beating ended, his last thought before darkness came a strange kind of gratitude, that pain had limits even if cruelty did not, and that unconsciousness was its own form of mercy in a place where mercy came only through the body's involuntary surrender to trauma too severe to process while remaining aware. When medical emergency was declared and prison protocol required intervention that even Cartwright could not completely suppress, Webb was transported to the prison infirmary, where the investigation's timeline accelerated toward its inevitable conclusion and the revelation that would transform everything. The prison infirmary existed in a strange liminal space between custody and care, staffed by contracted medical professionals who were bound by ethics that sometimes conflicted with the institutional imperatives of security and control. Dr. Harrison was 63 years old, a general practitioner who had taken the prison contract after retirement from private practice proved boring, expecting routine work and finding instead a front-row seat to systematic abuse that his medical training could not ignore and his conscience could not accept. When they brought Webb in unconscious, blood on his face and bruises that mapped Garrett's rage across his torso like a textbook illustration of assault, he documented everything with the meticulous precision of someone building a case even if he did not yet know for whom or toward what end. The medical report Harrison compiled was comprehensive and damning, detailing injuries consistent with systematic torture rather than isolated incidents, malnutrition suggesting deliberate deprivation, and psychological trauma that would require months of treatment to address. He submitted it through official channels to the state medical board as regulations required his signature on documents that represented professional judgment rendered without fear or favor. And for approximately 6 hours, that report existed in the system as evidence that could not be denied or explained away. Then it disappeared, erased from databases and recalled from transit before reaching external oversight, stolen on Warden Cartwright's orders by administrative staff who understood that employment security required loyalty to the institution rather than abstract principles like medical ethics or legal accountability. Harrison discovered the deletion during a routine follow-up check, his disbelief transforming into cold fury as he realized that the corruption extended beyond individual guards to encompass the entire administrative structure, and he began building a second file, this one kept on personal devices beyond the prison's reach, insurance against institutions that had forgotten their purpose. Officer Thornton volunteered for infirmary security duty, her request approved because staff shortages made any volunteer welcome, and because no one suspected that the quiet, single mother who rarely spoke at staff meetings might be planning rebellion. She used her position to provide Webb with the first honest human interaction he had experienced since entering Northfield. Conversations conducted in whispers during gaps in camera coverage, where she revealed her documentation and her decision to cooperate with whatever investigation he represented, because she had finally accepted that preserving her job was not worth preserving her complicity. Webb, recovering slowly under Harrison's care, felt the strange dissonance of being treated as human after weeks of systematic dehumanization, and he found it harder to maintain operational distance when basic kindness reminded him of everything he had temporarily surrendered for this mission. He passed comprehensive coded messages through Thornton, detailed intelligence about names and dates and evidence locations that would allow federal prosecutors to build cases extending beyond Garrett and Cartwright to the network of guards and administrators who had enabled abuse through action or silence. Raymond Foster used his influence to ensure that trusted inmates worked the infirmary cleaning detail, creating a protective perimeter that guards recognized but could not officially challenge without acknowledging the shadow power structure that maintained order more effectively than their batons and authority. He visited Webb during recreation periods, conversations brief but loaded with unspoken understanding that whatever Wells represented, it was important enough to protect until the truth revealed itself. Agent Okonkwo received Webb's comprehensive intelligence dump and immediately coordinated with DOJ prosecutors, FBI tactical teams, and federal marshals, building an operation that would descend on Northfield with overwhelming force and legal authority. She prepared warrants, briefed teams, and made arrangements for Webb's extraction and protection, knowing that the revelation would not end the danger, but transform it from systematic abuse into desperate cover-up attempts by men who understood their careers and freedom were now at stake. Meanwhile, Garrett spiraled into paranoia as he recognized that Webb's survival and transfer to the infirmary had created witnesses and documentation beyond his control. He intimidated Vasquez into signing false reports about Webb's injuries, claiming they resulted from self-harm and resistance rather than systematic beating, his desperation visible in the way his hands shook and his voice rose when challenged. And Officer Vasquez, signing documents he knew were perjury, felt the weight of complicity transformed from abstract moral failing into concrete criminal liability, understanding too late that silence was not safety, but participation in conspiracy.
Warden Cartwright orchestrated the cover-up with cold efficiency, holding emergency meetings with complicit staff to coordinate stories and eliminate evidence. His political connections mobilized to suppress external oversight, his expensive lawyers already preparing defenses based on plausible deniability and institutional complexity. But his confidence carried the brittleness of someone who had never actually been challenged by authority equal to his own. And he missed the signs that the walls he had built around his corruption were not impenetrable, but merely untested. That the law, when wielded by true believers, could penetrate bureaucracy and political connections with the precision of justice properly applied. Dr. Moreno visited the infirmary and had a brief conversation with Webb that confirmed suspicions she had been building through weeks of clinical observation and professional instinct. She did not ask directly who he was or what he represented, but her questions about his background and education suggested she had connected dots that others had missed. And when their eyes met, there was understanding that transcended words, recognition between professionals who served justice through different channels but toward the same ultimate end. Webb lay in the infirmary bed that night, his body healing while his mind consolidated the case he had built violation by violation, and he thought about the moment coming soon when Agent Okonkwo would walk through Northfield's gates with federal authority and the full weight of the Department of Justice, when his identity would be revealed and the suffering he had endured would transform from personal trauma into legal evidence, when every man who believed power meant immunity would learn that patience and documentation were weapons more powerful than any baton, that justice delayed was sometimes justice refined into something pure and unstoppable and absolutely certain. Webb's return to his cell marked the beginning of the end, though only he and Agent Okonkwo knew that the timeline had accelerated beyond anyone's control, that federal warrants were being prepared and tactical teams were being briefed, and the machinery of justice was moving with the inevitability of sunrise after the longest night. The prison atmosphere had changed in his absence, tension crackling through corridors like electricity before a storm, inmates sensing something brewing in the way that men who lived by instinct rather than information could feel shifts in power before they became visible. Guards moved differently now, their swagger replaced by nervousness, their jokes forced. And even Garrett's cruelty had taken on the desperate quality of a man who understood at some unconscious level that his dominion was not permanent but temporary, that every empire built on abuse eventually collapses under the weight of its own injustice.
Officer Vasquez avoided Garrett now, his guilt manifesting his physical distance, his false testimony sitting in his conscience like poison that spread with each passing day until he could barely meet his own eyes in the mirror or his children's eyes at the dinner table. Dr. Moreno submitted her formal memo to the State Department of Corrections, documenting irregularities in solitary confinement protocols with the clinical precision of someone who knew the document would be ignored, but needed to create the paper trail that would matter later when federal investigators came asking who had tried to intervene and who had looked away. Warden Cartwright learned about Moreno's memo through administrative channels and immediately moved to have her contract terminated, his response revealing the extent to which he would sacrifice anyone to protect the system he had built. But his attempt to silence her created exactly the kind of documentation that federal prosecutors would use to prove not just individual cruelty, but institutional conspiracy. The confrontation between Garrett and Thornton came during a shift change when he caught her lingering near Webb's cell. His paranoia transformed into accusation, his threats explicit about her job and her custody of her son, and everything she would lose if she did not remain loyal to the unwritten code that demanded silence from anyone who wanted to survive in this place. But Thornton had already crossed the line from observer to participant. Her decision made during those 3 days when Webb lay unconscious in the infirmary, and she had finally understood that complicity was not safety, but moral suicide. That protecting her son meant creating a world where good people did not have to choose between conscience and survival. She wore a wire the next shift, the recording device provided through channels she would never reveal, but which connected to Agent Okonkwo's network, and she captured Garrett's threats with digital clarity that would later become Exhibit 47 in the federal prosecution's case against institutional corruption at Northfield Maximum Security Prison. Raymond Foster received a message through T-Bone's external networks, coded language that suggested something was coming, that the quiet man in cell 147 was not what he appeared, and that the prison would soon understand why his patience had been strategic rather than weak. Webb observed the increased tension through the bars of his cell, recognizing the signs that his ordeal was ending, that Agent Okonkwo had activated final protocols, that dawn would bring not another day of suffering, but the revelation that would transform victim into judge and documentation into prosecution. And in that recognition, he felt not triumph, but exhaustion. The weight of everything he had endured settling into his bones with the knowledge that survival was not the same as victory, that the scars he carried would outlast any sentences handed down to the men who had inflicted them. Thunder. FBI agents and federal marshals and Department of Justice investigators descending on Northfield Maximum Security Prison with warrants that had been sealed until the moment of execution to prevent the destruction of evidence or the flight of suspects. Warden Cartwright was taken into custody in his office while reviewing budget reports, his composed facade cracking for the first time as federal agents read him his rights and informed him that he was charged with civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit torture under color of law. His expensive suit and political connections meant nothing to agents who served warrants signed by judges who outranked him in every hierarchy that mattered. And his cold calculation finally gave way to the fear of a man who understood that the walls he had built around his corruption were not impenetrable, but illusory. Officer Derek Garrett was mid-shift in D Block when Agent Sarah Okonkwo walked through the solitary wing with federal marshals flanking her, their presence so unexpected and so overwhelming that he initially believed the raid was unrelated to him, that some other crime or criminal had triggered federal intervention. But Okonkwo walked directly to Webb's cell with the certainty of someone executing a plan that had been months in the making. And when she addressed the man inside, not as Inmate Wells, but as Your Honor, the words landed like a bomb in Garrett's consciousness, destroying in an instant everything he had believed about power and authority and his own invulnerability. Webb stood slowly, his body still healing from Garrett's beating, but his bearing transformed in that moment from victim to judge, and he met Garrett's eyes with the full weight of his authority finally revealed. Officer Garrett, I am Federal Judge Marcus Webb, and I have spent the last 63 days documenting every violation of law, every act of cruelty, every instance of systematic torture that you and this institution have inflicted not just on me, but on every man imprisoned here. His voice carried the precision of someone delivering a verdict from which there would be no appeal. You are under arrest, and you will face justice not in the corrupt system you have exploited, but in federal court where the evidence I have gathered will ensure that your abuse ends today and your freedom ends when the jury returns its verdict. Federal agents read Garrett's his rights while he stammered denials and disbelief, his world imploding with the realization that his victim had always been his superior in every way that mattered, that every blow he had struck and every humiliation he had inflicted had been documented by a man with the authority to transform abuse into evidence and suffering into prosecution. Officer Thornton's recordings and photographs were entered as evidence. Officer Vasquez confessed voluntarily and agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges, and Raymond Foster provided testimony about the systematic abuse he had witnessed, his cooperation rewarded with Webb's recommendation for sentence reduction. The media descended on Northfield within hours.
the story breaking nationally with the kind of coverage that transcended typical prison abuse scandals, because it involved a federal judge who had voluntarily endured torture to expose corruption. Webb was reunited with Diana via phone, their conversation private but emotional. 26 years of marriage and trust allowing them to communicate in the space between words, her relief and his exhaustion meeting in the acknowledgement that he had survived, but that survival had come at a cost they would spend months processing together. 2 weeks after the raid, Webb sat in his home office trying to reconcile the man who had entered Northfield with the man who had emerged. His body recovering faster than his mind, his sleep still interrupted by nightmares where Garrett's voice echoed through corridors that never ended. Diana watched him with the careful attention of someone who understood that trauma did not disappear with justice, that PTSD was not weakness, but the natural consequence of experiencing horror.
Systematic abuse, and she made the appointment with the therapist who specialized in trauma without asking his permission because she knew he would delay indefinitely if given the choice. Federal prosecutors built their cases with the meticulous precision of people who understood that this prosecution would set precedents for prison reform nationwide, and the grand jury returned indictments that totaled 47 counts against Garrett, 19 against Cartwright, and charges against 15 other prison employees ranging from assault to conspiracy to obstruction. Congressional hearings were announced, Webb's testimony requested, and he faced the decision that would define his future: return to the bench or pivot to full-time advocacy, using his story as a platform for the systemic change that policy alone could never achieve. Officer Maya Thornton lived in protective custody while providing testimony to federal investigators, her job gone but her conscience clear, her son confused about why they had moved but safe in the way that children are safe when their parents make hard choices for right reasons. Raymond Foster's legal team filed motions for sentence reduction, the process slow because justice for individuals within broken systems always moved slower than punishment of the system itself, but his case had become symbolic of the possibility that cooperation and rehabilitation could be recognized and rewarded. Garrett awaited trial in county jail, experiencing the powerlessness he had inflicted for 12 years, his mental state deteriorating as he confronted the reality that he would spend the next decade or more in the same kind of cage where he had once been God. Cartwright maintained his composure and hired expensive lawyers who would mount defenses based on plausible deniability, but Webb's documentation was too comprehensive and too precise for any jury to accept that the warden had not known what was happening under his authority and with his approval. And as the legal machinery ground forward with the slow certainty of justice properly applied, Webb understood that conviction in court was necessary but not sufficient, that real change required transforming his suffering into policy and his testimony into legislation that would prevent future victims from enduring what he had voluntarily chosen to document. 6 months after the raid, Judge Marcus Webb stood before the Congressional Committee on Prison Reform in chambers filled with cameras and journalists, and the kind of attention that transforms individual suffering into national conversation. He testified for 4 hours, his words carrying the authority of someone who had experienced systematic abuse not as abstract policy failure but as concrete reality. And he used his unique position as both victim and judge to advocate for comprehensive reform that would prevent future atrocities. Officer Derek Garrett had been convicted on 22 of 28 counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, poetic justice that Webb acknowledged without satisfaction because he understood that individual punishment was necessary but not sufficient, that real change required transforming systems rather than merely replacing the men who operated them. Warden James Cartwright accepted a plea deal that gave him 8 years and permanent disbarment from corrections work, his political connections securing reduced charges but not immunity, his fall from power complete but his comfortable retirement fund intact in ways that reminded Webb why systemic reform mattered more than individual accountability. Webb had made his decision during long conversations with Diana, who had joined him in advocacy work using her civil rights legal background,
Their marriage strengthened through shared purpose even as they both carried scars from his voluntary descent into hell. He announced his leave of absence from the bench to work with a coalition of civil rights organizations, understanding that his story provided a platform that few others could claim, and that wasting it would dishonor everyone who had suffered in silence. Officer Maya Thornton found new purpose as a corrections reform trainer. Her experience encouraged making her invaluable to programs teaching ethics and accountability to future officers, proof that complicity could be overcome and transformation was possible. Raymond Foster's sentence was reduced by 5 years, and he became a jailhouse lawyer, helping other inmates navigate legal systems that were designed to be incomprehensible. His intelligence finally recognized and his humanity restored through small victories that accumulated like drops filling an empty reservoir. The final scene brought Webb back to Northfield as part of the DOJ monitoring team overseeing the prison's federal receivership, and he walked corridors he once walked in chains, pausing at cell 147 where he had endured 63 days of systematic torture. He felt no triumph in that moment, only the weight of memory and the determination that his suffering would mean something beyond his personal vindication. He addressed a training class of new corrections officers, telling them his story not for revenge, but as warning and instruction, his words carrying the authority of someone who understood that power without accountability was tyranny, and that justice required constant vigilance from people willing to choose conscience over comfort. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.